Right, so this rather fetching plant behind me is Lantana camara, and this is an invasive weed, and I'm going to kill it. So first up, what is Lantana camara? Lantana camara is also called wild sage or tickberry. I usually call it devil's mint, but that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek name because it has a fairly aromatic smell. Its leaves are not entirely unminty, has a similar texture, although much woodier usually than most mints, and yeah, it is very difficult to eradicate entirely. It is fully naturalized in most of southern and eastern Africa, but it's originally from Central and South America, basically the drier ranges of the tropics, up to about 3 meters, I think, of annual rainfall, but down to slightly less than we get around Lusaka. In cooler places where there's a lot of frost, it really won't thrive. It really is a tropical plant. It was brought to Africa as an ornamental because it is covered in beautiful flowers which are fantastic for pollinators, and the berries are a really great way to attract birds. Unfortunately, it is also one of a group of plants, including a fair few of our problematic invaders, which are allelopathic, which means they change the soil chemistry in a way that makes it much less hospitable for other plants. I had assumed that this is done by dropping leaves, which have a fairly distinctive chemistry, and gradually changing the soil surface, but apparently there is actually a secretion comes from their roots and shoots as well, which would contribute quite a lot to that. Which does lead into the second point of why would I try to get rid of it. As well as it poisoning the soil, there is also the issue that it is illegal in a lot of countries, from South Africa all the way up, I think, to Kenya, to let this grow without taking reasonable steps to control it. So you can face either a fine or in some places losing your land if you aren't taking steps to control this. As far as I know, those aren't enforced anymore in any countries because it is fully naturalized, and significant parts of our ecosystems are starting to adapt to it. So we have things like our milkweed locusts, things like our Amoris butterflies, and two non-native species, so a moth and a lacebug from Central America that were introduced to Kenya and South Africa, which was spread throughout most of the region, which do feed on this. So the lacebug feeds on the flowers and reduces fruiting and therefore seeding of this, and that's actually very common around here now. If you crumble up a flower of lantana, quite often you will find some in there, and they really are helping reduce its sort of vitality. And the moth feeds directly on the plant itself and weakens it and reduces its sort of capacity to spread and choke out everything else. So let me get on to how we remove it. So the basic thing is to cut it back and then remove the roots. Now, if they're small enough, you don't really have to cut them back. You can just grab them around the roots. They're shallow rooted, and they don't need to have all the roots come up to kill the plant. You basically just need to get the crown, which is where the roots meet the sort of above ground stem. That needs to come out because the roots very, very rarely turn into new shoots. They can, but it's much more common for large woody shoots to root into soil to form roots from the stems, rather than the roots that have already specialized into root tissue to start producing more basic stem tissues. So basically what we're going to do is cut in and try and find the shoot. This is a very large one, and with very large ones, not only do you have that tending to sort of once the woody stems start to reach the ground again, if they're still alive, they then tend to reroot, so you get multiple rooting points. You also find that they tend to tangle through a lot. They get very leggy, which means that when you cut a bit, you're not entirely sure where that's going to come out when you pull it, so you'll see this is a bit chaotic. But once you've cut enough of that back, and you want to make sure you keep the smaller fragile twigs lowest in your pile of waste if you're just going to leave it on the ground. I have cut the grass here already, so we do have a layer of grass which will insulate this from the soil, which should mean that those smaller twigs do not have the energy, if they do start to produce roots, to reach down into the soil itself, especially because we've had about 3 weeks of an unusually dry spell for this time of year, which means this plant is already stressed, it doesn't have much energy, and it shouldn't be an issue. But if you're really worried about that, you can put it on black plastic. Some people burn it, but actually if it's allowed to dry out fully and actually die, it will make perfectly reasonable mulch. The only parts that will take a while for that are the woody stems, because they can take about a year to die. So the big thick woody stems, anything that's significantly thicker than your thumb, anything you have to work to get your loppers or secateurs through, you are going to want to put right on top of the pile of the rest of the things, especially if it already has roots on, because those parts will have a lot more energy in reserve and can root through a lot further. But again, if they are on top of a pile of a large amount, it won't get down. If you're just pulling up small ones, one thing that I do quite like to do is just hook them over another small shrub until they've dried out, and then they can go on the ground and they're not going to be a problem. The other thing you want to do is avoid disturbing the soil excessively. Now, there are some prickly pears here. I think these are probably ones my grandmother planted, and she did plant a few varieties, so with a bit of light I would like to see how they fruit, so I don't want to disrupt them. But the real reason not to disturb the ground is this is an invasion specialist. Most invasive weeds are used to going into disturbed environments, and so what you don't want to do in removing them is create a system, especially where they've been growing. Like this one has probably been here since I came back from studying overseas, so this is at least a 10-year-old plant. So it's been dropping seeds all that time, and those are in the seed bank, and if I disturb the soil here, that's going to create a lovely opening for them to come up. I will be checking here in future years, making sure no small ones come up and pulling them up while they're small and easy to remove, but I don't want to have to do that long term, so I want to minimize the amount of soil I disrupt. So we're going to try and keep everything else as much as possible intact. We're not going to be going in with heavy machinery, we're just going to be going in chopping through until we get to the big stem and then pulling that away. We're also going to leave what plants we can on top of the soil. So that prickly pear, so for example there's a few mango saplings have come up despite this because they have a very large seed, they have the energy often to overcome chemical barriers. We've also got a musakili come up in here, and we've got a couple of other little bits and pieces, including a Philanthus, which is quite a nice one in Zambia for excluding lantana because its berries are very similar. They perform a similar role for birds, and so often if you have enough of those around, the birds will be feeding on those rather than the lantana berries because they're more used to it. They have spent a lot more time adapting to digest native berries than non-native ones. So if you can encourage those in the areas where you have lantana, you will find the lantana gradually is spreading a little bit less. So once we've got rid of all these sort of spreading growth, and it is worth noting, if you have one that is entirely upright and just going up through a tree, sometimes it's perfectly reasonable to just cut it through. If none of the branches touching the ground, just cut it through and remove the stem, and then try and remove as much of the sort of base of that as you can, and you can just leave it sitting up in the tree, and the leaves will drop off in a few days, and it won't be affecting the light nearly so much, and a lot of things will come up quite merrily underneath it. But with this one, because it arches all the way down to the ground, if I was to do that, there'd be a very good chance it would reroot, or that I would miss a rooted stem, and then within that, we were going to have a big tangle to try and get through to get rid of anything that reshoots. So with that said, when one is arching down to the ground like that, it is much better, as here, to remove as much as possible of the above ground growth, just for access if something does spring up here that you don't want to be springing up here. And then we're finally going to be getting onto the stems themselves, and here some of them will just pull up. They are very shallow rooted. You do sometimes have to break a few roots, but again, those roots will not easily regenerate into stems. You can come and check, and when they're just on one or two roots, they pull up much more easily than the original did. But also those roots will die back and shrink. So if this was a very large trunk and I couldn't actually remove it, I would cut it down as low as possible to remove as much mass as possible from above ground, which removes as much energy as possible from this, and then when it's regenerating, it's going to have to draw that from the roots, which means the root system is going to get smaller as it produces more shoots. And with very big ones in the past, I've done that for a couple of years in a row. You just cut it all the way back, cut it all the way back, and then after a few years, when the rains are here and the ground is really soft, it's much easier to pull it up or dig it up relatively easily compared to how it was when you first tried. But for this one, although these stems are quite big and they are quite stubborn, it's not that hard to get them all up. So what I'm going to do is just dig them all up and put all those big bases right on top of the pile of waste that I have removed, and they are going to slowly dry out in the sun. It will take about a year probably for some of the bigger ones to die, as they are in direct sunlight most of the year here. It shouldn't take so long. But some of them will probably be still showing some signs of life deep inside for a while, so you do want to keep them off the ground for that, and you don't want to move them straight onto a compost heap where they will have perfect rooting opportunities. Yeah, and that should be it.